The sun shone brightly over the sprawling Carter family ranch in the heart of Texas.
Rows of white chairs were neatly lined up under towering oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Crystal chandeliers hung from canopies of silk, sparkling in the midday light. Guests dressed in their finest suits and dresses gathered, laughing and chatting, glasses of champagne clinking with each toast. It was the wedding of the year. Jacob Carter, the heir to the Carter Ranch, was finally getting married to Emma Mitchell, the quiet but kind-hearted girl from the neighboring town. Emma stood in front of the mirror in the upstairs room of the Carter mansion, her white satin gown flowing gracefully around her feet. The lace sleeves hugged her arms, and the delicate veil framed her soft features. Her hands were slightly trembling as she adjusted her earrings, the diamonds catching the sunlight streaming through the large bay windows. Her best friend, Sarah, stood beside her, beaming with joy. "You look absolutely stunning, Emma," Sarah whispered, her eyes glimmering with pride. "Jacob is one lucky man." Emma smiled back, though her eyes carried a flicker of anxiety. "I hope everything goes well today," she replied softly, brushing her hands over the bodice of her dress to smooth the fabric. Before Sarah could respond, the door creaked open, and Margaret Carter stepped inside. Her tall frame cast a shadow over the room, her sharp heels clicking against the wooden floor. She was dressed impeccably in a navy blue gown, her silver hair tied back into a tight bun, lips painted in a deep crimson. Her eyes scanned Emma from head to toe with a critical gaze. "Emma," Margaret spoke, her tone clipped and authoritative. "You look presentable." Emma swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." Margaret stepped closer, her heels echoing with each step. She placed a firm hand on Emma's shoulder, her eyes locking onto Emma's with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "I trust you understand what is expected of you now that you are marrying into the Carter family," Margaret began, her voice dropping to a whisper, sharp as a blade. "This family needs an heir. Asson. I hope you are aware of the responsibility you are about to take on." Emma's hands tightened around the bouquet she was holding. "Of course," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Margaret's lips curled into a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good," she nodded firmly. "Remember, this family doesn't tolerate failure." With that, she turned sharply on her heels and exited the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Sarah moved closer, her face pale. "That woman gives me the creeps," she murmured. "Are you sure you want to do this, Emma?" Emma looked back at her friend, her eyes glimmering with determination. "I love Jacob," she said, her voice steadier than before. "And I can handle his mother. I have to." The music began to play from outside, the soft strains of violins drifting up through the open windows. Emma took a deep breath, smoothing her gown one last time. "It's time," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The ceremony was picturesque, perfect, even. Emma walked down the aisle with grace, her eyes locked onto Jacob, who stood tall and handsome in his tailored suit, a smile of pure admiration lighting up his face. He reached out to take her hand as she approached, his touch warm and reassuring. For a moment, all the tension melted away, leaving only the two of them standing under the archway of flowers, vowing their lives to one another. But Margaret's eyes never softened. She stood off to the side, her gaze piercing and unyielding, watching Emma's every movement with a scrutiny that did not waver. Her fingers drummed rhythmically against the clutch she held, her jaw clenched in determination. When the ceremony concluded, guests gathered for the reception in the grand hall. Laughter filled the room, and glasses clinked as toasts were made to the new couple. Emma tried her best to enjoy the moment, dancing with Jacob, greeting guests, accepting congratulations. But she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching her every move, cold, judgmental eyes. It wasn't until the cutting of the cake that Margaret approached again, her steps deliberate and sharp. She stood next to Emma, placing a hand on her arm with a grip that was just a little too tight. "Enjoy this moment while you can," Margaret whispered into her ear, her voice laced with warning. "Your real work begins soon." Emma looked up startled, but Margaret had already stepped away, her back turned, gliding through the crowd with an air of authority that commanded silence wherever she passed. Jacob returned moments later, a glass of champagne in his hand and a smile on his face. "There you are," he said, leaning down to kiss Emma's cheek.
"I've been looking for you."
Emma forced a smile, glancing back at Margaret's retreating figure. I'm here, she replied softly.
Am reikt hier.
But deep inside, Emma knew that this was just the beginning. Margaret's words echoed in her mind, heavy with expectations and veiled threats. She squeezed Jacob's hand just a bit tighter, as if anchoring herself in place. The music played on, and the guests continued to celebrate, but the chill of Margaret's presence lingered in the room, like a storm cloud looming just beyond the horizon, silent but inevitable. The first few months of marriage were blissful for Emma and Jacob. Despite Margaret's cold demeanor, Emma found solace in the love and kindness Jacob showed her. They spent quiet mornings together, sipping coffee on the porch of the Carter estate, watching the sun rise over the rolling hills of the ranch. Jacob would kiss her forehead before heading out to tend to the cattle and manage the workers, while Emma busied herself with organizing the household and learning the ins and outs of ranch life. For a moment, Emma allowed herself to believe that happiness could last. She began to dream of a future where the walls of the grand estate would echo with the laughter of children, their children. One chilly morning, as Emma was scrubbing the porch steps, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. Her vision blurred, and she grasped the wooden railing for support. A maid nearby rushed over.
Mrs. Carter, are you all right?
Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. Yes. I think so. Just a little light-headed.
The maid's eyes sparkled with curiosity.
You've been looking a bit pale lately. Maybe you should check with the doctor. Emma brushed it off, but as the days passed, the symptoms grew stronger, nausea in the mornings, fatigue that clung to her every step. Finally, with Jacob's encouragement, she visited Dr. Matthews, the town's trusted physician. A week later, Emma found herself sitting in Dr. Matthews' cozy office, the smell of cedar and old books lingering in the air. The doctor entered with a smile on his face, carrying a folder of test results. Mrs. Carter, he began warmly, congratulations.
You're pregnant.
Emma's heart leaped in her chest.
I'm pregnant?
Dr. Matthews nodded. About 12 weeks along, by my estimate. Both you and the baby seem to be perfectly healthy. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she placed a hand on her abdomen, marveling at the life growing inside her. Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much, she whispered, her voice shaking with joy.
The ride back to the ranch seemed like a dream.
Emma clutched the paperwork from the doctor's office, her fingers trembling with excitement. She couldn't wait to tell Jacob. When she arrived home, she found him in the stables, brushing down one of the horses. His face lit up when he saw her. Emma.
You're back. Everything all right?
Emma couldn't hold back her smile. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck.
Jacob, I'm pregnant.
We're having a baby. Jacob pulled back, his eyes wide with shock.
You're serious?
Emma nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Yes. 12 weeks along. The doctor said everything looks good. For a moment, Jacob stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, his face broke into the widest grin Emma had ever seen. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in circles. Emma. We're going to be parents, he shouted, his voice echoing through the stables. Their laughter filled the space, drawing the attention of the ranch hands who watched with smiles of their own. For the first time since their wedding, Emma felt like everything was going to be okay. She held Jacob close, inhaling the familiar scent of hay and leather, letting herself be swept up in the joy of the moment. But the celebration was short-lived. That evening, as they gathered in the grand dining room for dinner, Emma decided to share the news with Margaret and David. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting warm light across the polished oak table. Plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread were set neatly in front of them. Emma cleared her throat nervously, glancing at Jacob for reassurance. He nodded encouragingly. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, Emma began, her voice steady. I wanted to share some news. Jacob and I are expecting a baby. David's face brightened instantly, his eyes crinkling with delight. That's wonderful news, Emma, he exclaimed, reaching across the table to pat her hand. Congratulations to both of you. Emma beamed, turning to Margaret with hope in her eyes. But Margaret's expression remained stoic, her fork pausing mid-air. She placed it down neatly, folding her hands in her lap. Did the doctor confirm the gender? Emma blinked, momentarily stunned by the question. Oh, no. It's still too early to tell, she replied. Margaret's gaze hardened, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table. Well, let's not celebrate just yet. I expect you to find out as soon as possible, she stated coolly.
We need a boy, Emma.
The Cotter name must be carried on. I trust you understand that. The room fell silent. Emma glanced at Jacob, but he only stared down at his plate, avoiding her gaze. David cleared his throat awkwardly, reaching for his glass of wine. Emma swallowed, her hands trembling slightly beneath the table. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret nodded once, satisfied. Good. I'll arrange an appointment with Dr. Matthews. We need to be certain. Emma forced a smile, though her heart clenched painfully. The joy that had filled her chest just hours before now felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. She forced herself to take a bite of food, chewing slowly as Margaret continued her meal with precision and poise, as if nothing had just transpired. That night, as Emma lay in bed beside Jacob, her hand gently resting on her belly, she felt a tear slip down her cheek. Jacob reached over, placing his hand on top of hers.
Don't worry, he whispered softly.
Everything will be fine. Emma nodded, squeezing his hand, but her heart knew better. Margaret's words echoed in her mind, laced with expectation and thinly veiled threats. For the first time, Emma began to fear not just for herself, but for the baby growing inside her. Outside their window, the wind howled against the trees, carrying whispers of a storm yet to come. The days that followed Emma's pregnancy announcement were filled with both anticipation and anxiety. Margaret wasted no time in arranging a private ultrasound at the Carter family's preferred clinic in Austin. Emma felt her nerves coil tighter with each passing day, dreading what might come of the results. On the morning of the appointment, the sky was overcast, thick clouds gathering ominously over the vast expanse of the Carter ranch. Margaret was punctual as always, appearing at the doorway of Emma's room with her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors. Get dressed. We're leaving in 15 minutes, she announced, her tone as cold and unyielding as ever. Emma stood by the window, her hands resting protectively over her small but growing belly. Jacob's not coming with us? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Margaret raised an eyebrow, lips pursing tightly. Jacob has responsibilities here. This is a woman's matter, she replied briskly. And besides, I want this done right. Emma bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the wooden floorboards. She wanted Jacob there, needed him there, but Margaret had a way of shutting down any disagreement before it even began. The drive to the clinic was silent and tense. Margaret sat in the front seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. Emma sat in the back, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the landscape blur past the window. Fields of cotton and sunflowers stretched endlessly, swaying under the gray sky. To Emma, it felt like they were leaving behind the last vestiges of freedom. At the clinic, Margaret handled everything. She spoke with the receptionist, filled out the forms, and escorted Emma straight to the examination room as though she owned the place. Dr. Collins, a tall man with graying hair and a kind smile, greeted them warmly.
Mrs. Carter, Emma.
Congratulations on the pregnancy, he said, shaking their hands. Margaret didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to know the gender, she stated flatly. Dr. Collins's smile faltered, but he nodded. Of course. We can perform the ultrasound now, and if the baby is positioned correctly, we should be able to determine that for you. Emma lay back on the examination bed, her hands instinctively covering her belly. The cold gel smeared across her skin made her shiver. She looked up at the monitor, her heart pounding. This was supposed to be a moment of joy, but the air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Dr. Collins moved the ultrasound probe across her abdomen, and slowly, the black and white image of her baby flickered onto the screen. Emma's eyes welled up with tears. The tiny form was perfect, small hands, delicate limbs, a beating heart strong and steady. She reached out instinctively, her fingertips brushing the screen. There's your baby, Dr. Collins said gently. Everything seems to be developing beautifully. Emma felt warmth flood her heart, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she forgot Margaret was in the room, she forgot about the expectations, the pressure, the fear. It was just her and her child. But Margaret's voice broke the silence. Doctor, the gender, she pressed impatiently. Dr. Collins hesitated, glancing at Emma before turning back to the screen. Yes, of course, he murmured, adjusting the probe slightly. He squinted at the screen, then nodded.
It's a girl.
The room fell silent.
Emma esat soared, a girl.
Her baby was a little girl. She pictured tiny dresses, ponytails, bedtime stories, and dance recitals. But before she could express her joy, Margaret's hand slammed down on the edge of the examination table, the loud thud causing Emma to flinch. A girl. Margaret repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. Dr. Collins nodded slowly, eyes flicking between the two women.
Yes, ma'am. A Elsie baby girl.
Margaret's lips thinned, her jaw clenched. This is unacceptable, she hissed, her voice barely containing her fury. She turned to Emma, eyes blazing.
You promisez me en air. You promisez me à son.
Emma's hands instinctively covered her stomach, shielding her unborn child from the venom in Margaret's voice. I didn't promise anything, she stammered. I can't control this. She's still our baby. She's still your grandchild. But Margaret wasn't listening. She turned back to Dr. Collins. Schedule another appointment. I want this fixed, she demanded. Emma's eyes widened in horror. Fixed? What do you mean? Margaret's gaze was icy. I mean, we cannot waste time with mistakes. This needs to be taken care of. We'll try again for a boy.
Emma's blood ran cold.
No, she whispered, shaking her head.
No, you can't do that. This is my baby. This is my doctor.
Margaret stepped forward, towering over Emma with a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. That is my heir you are carrying, she spat. And if it's not a son, it is nothing. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at Dr. Collins, desperation shining in her eyes. But he only looked away, his expression blank. Margaret straightened her coat, her eyes never leaving Emma's. We leave in 5 minutes, she declared. Get dressed. Emma sat up slowly, her mind spinning, her hands trembling. She felt the walls closing in, the air growing thin. Margaret left the room, slamming the door behind her, and Emma was alone. Her eyes darted around the room, at the white walls, the sterile medical equipment, the window half cracked open, the parking lot just below. Her breath quickened. If she left now, if she ran, she could save her baby. Emma took one last look at the ultrasound monitor, at the tiny image of her daughter, a daughter she hadn't even met but already loved more than anything in the world. Her decision solidified. She would not let them take her baby away. She grabbed her purse, flung open the window, and climbed out onto the fire escape. The iron steps were cold and slick beneath her feet, but she moved quickly, fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. Below, the sound of Margaret's heels clicking back toward the room sent Emma flying down the steps even faster. She didn't stop running, not when she reached the ground, not when she stumbled through the back alley, and not when she disappeared into the crowded streets of downtown Austin. Emma knew she was leaving everything behind, but she also knew she was carrying everything she needed. Her daughter. Emma ran for what felt like hours, her legs burning and her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bustling streets of downtown Austin blurred past her, cars honking, pedestrians chatting, the chaos of city life rushing by. She clutched her purse tightly, her other hand instinctively wrapped around her belly.
There was no plan, only the desperate urge to escape.
Her feet finally slowed as she reached the edge of the city, where towering buildings gave way to narrower streets and modest apartment complexes. Exhausted and trembling, Emma ducked into a small diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. The waitress behind the counter looked up, eyebrows raised at Emma's disheveled appearance. You okay, hon? She asked, her voice thick with a southern drawl. Emma forced a nod. I just need a moment, she replied, sinking into the nearest booth. The waitress didn't press further, simply poured her a cup of coffee and slid it across the table. On the house, she said with a kind smile. Emma wrapped her hands around the warm mug, her fingers shaking slightly. The reality of what she had done crashed over her in waves. She had run away. She had left everything behind, the Carter estate, Jacob, the life she had once dreamed of, all for the fragile hope of keeping her daughter safe. The waitress returned with a notepad. You look like you need a bite to eat. I'm Sandy, by the way, she introduced herself. Emma hesitated before answering. Emma, she said quietly.
Juste Emma.
Sandy scribbled on the pad. Nice to meet you, just Emma, she said with a grin. How about I get you some soup? It's warm and won't sit heavy. You look like you could use it. Emma nodded gratefully, and within minutes, a steaming bowl of chicken soup was placed in front of her. As she sipped, the warmth spread through her chest, calming her nerves. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. After she finished, Emma knew she couldn't stay there forever. She needed a place to rest, to think, to figure out her next steps. Her hands shook as she pulled out her wallet, fumbling with the few crumpled bills she had left. Sandy saw her struggle and waved it off.
Don't worry, sweetheart.
It's on me. Emma's eyes welled with tears. Thank you, she whispered, voice cracking. Sandy reached out and squeezed Emma's hand gently. If you need help, there's a little motel a few blocks down. Not fancy, but the owner is decent. Tell him Sandy sent you. He'll give you a good rate. Emma nodded, standing up shakily. Thank you, she repeated, the words heavy with gratitude. She pushed open the door and stepped back into the brisk afternoon air, her mind racing. The motel was exactly as Sandy described, small, slightly worn, but clean. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, buzzing faintly. Emma walked to the front desk, where an older man with kind eyes looked up from his newspaper. Help you, miss? He asked, folding the paper neatly. Yes.
Sandy from The Dîner sans me.
I need a room, she replied, her voice trembling just a bit. The man's eyes softened.
Sandy.
Good woman. If she sent you, I suppose you need a place to lay low for a while, he said, his tone gentle. How about room 5? It's at the end of the hall, quiet, and the heater works fine. Emma nodded, pulling out the little money she had. He waved his hand.
You pay me when you can, all right?
No rush. Her eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them away. Thank you, she whispered for what felt like the 100th time that day. Room 5 was modest, a single bed with a floral quilt, a wooden dresser with a mirror cracked at the corner, and a small bathroom with a flickering light bulb. It wasn't grand, it wasn't the Carter estate, but to Emma, it was safety. She collapsed onto the bed, her hand resting protectively over her belly. We did it, she whispered, voice shaking with relief. We're safe, baby.
I promise elle keep you safe.
Days turned into weeks. Emma stayed hidden, venturing out only to the corner store for groceries or to the library where she would read parenting books for hours, soaking up every bit of information she could. She found small jobs, cleaning houses, waitressing at Sandy's diner during lunch hours. It was hard work, her feet ached, her back throbbed, but she endured it all with a quiet determination. Every night, she would return to room 5, counting the meager dollars she had earned, setting aside enough for rent and food. The rest she saved in a small tin can under her bed labeled for the baby. Sandy would often visit, bringing leftovers from the diner or offering to help fold the baby clothes Emma had thrifted and washed by hand. Sandy never asked questions, and Emma never offered explanations, but their quiet understanding grew into a deep bond. Winter settled over Austin, bringing biting winds and gray skies. Emma's belly grew heavier, her hands swollen from the strain of work. But each kick, each tiny flutter reminded her that she was not alone. There was life inside her, strong and persistent. One evening, as Emma carefully folded a tiny yellow blanket she had stitched herself, she felt the first ripple of pain. It started slow, like a gentle wave, then grew stronger, crashing through her with fierce intensity. She doubled over, gasping, her hands gripping the edge of the bed. Panic swelled in her chest. She was alone. Sandy was closing the diner. There was no one to help. Emma forced herself to breathe, the way she'd read in the books.
Inhale, exhale, focus.
But the pain did not subside, it grew sharper, more insistent. Emma fumbled for her phone, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She dialed Sandy's number, each ring feeling like an eternity. Finally, Sandy picked up, her voice warm and familiar.
Hey, sugar. What is going on?
Emma's voice was strained, breathless. It's time.
The baby, she's coming.
There was silence on the other end, then the scrape of a chair, the clatter of keys.
Hold tight, honey.
I'm coming.
Just hold on.
Emma sank to the floor, back pressed against the bed frame, eyes squeezed shut. Just a little longer, she whispered to her daughter. Just a little longer, and I'll finally get to meet you. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, blanketing the streets in white. And Emma held on, with nothing but sheer willpower and the fierce love of a mother protecting her child. Snow blanketed the streets of Austin, casting a serene stillness over the bustling city. Flakes drifted down from heavy clouds, settling softly on rooftops and sidewalks, turning the world into a canvas of white. But inside room 5 of the modest roadside motel, chaos unfolded. Emma gripped the edge of the mattress, her knuckles white, sweat beading across her forehead. Waves of pain crashed through her body, unrelenting and fierce. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her eyes squeezed shut as she braced herself against the next contraction.
Hold on, Honey.
I'm here, Sandy's voice called out as she burst through the door, cheeks flushed from the cold and the rush to get there. Her hands were full, towels, bottled water, and a first aid kit that looked older than Emma herself. Emma's eyes fluttered open, relief flooding her face.
Sandy.
She gasped, reaching out instinctively. Sandy dropped the supplies on the bed and knelt beside her. I got you, sweetheart, she said firmly, brushing Emma's damp hair from her face.
We're gonna get through this, alright? Just breathe.
Emma nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched Sandy's arm. It hurts, she whispered, voice cracking. Sandy squeezed her hand. I know it does. But you're strong, Emma. I've seen you fight for that little girl every single day.
This is just one more step.
Emma's eyes watered, and she nodded determinedly. Another contraction ripped through her, and she cried out, fingers digging into Sandy's arm.
Sandy barely flinched, holding her steady.
All right, let's get you more comfortable, Sandy instructed. With surprising strength, she helped Emma onto the bed, propping her up with pillows and laying towels underneath. I called an ambulance, but with this snow, there's no telling how long they'll take. Looks like it's just you and me for now. Emma's eyes widened with fear. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. Sandy cupped her face gently, her eyes firm but warm. You can. You already have. You ran from that place, you fought for your baby, and you survived.
Now you're gonna bring her into this world.
And I'm right here with you.
Emma stared into Sandy's eyes, the world sinking in like a lifeline.
She took a deep breath, nodding shakily. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Time became a blur after that. Pain and pressure surged in waves, crashing through Emma with brutal force. Sandy held her hand the entire time, whispering encouragements, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, and helping her breathe through every contraction. Hours passed.
The storm outside Grey-Wivier, snow peeling up against the motel windows.
The flickering light bulb in the bathroom cast long shadows across the walls, and the wind howled like a distant warning. But inside that small, cramped room, life pushed forward. Emma screamed through clenched teeth, her body trembling with the effort. I can't, she cried out, her voice raw.
I can't do it.
Yes, you can. Sandy insisted, her hands firm on Emma's shoulders.
You are so close, Emma. Just one more push. For your doctor.
For Grace. The name slipped out before Emma could even process it, but the sound of it, Grace, seemed to fill the room with light. Emma's eyes flashed with determination, and she nodded fiercely. For Grace, she repeated, her voice stronger. Drawing in the deepest breath she could manage, Emma pushed with every ounce of strength she had left. Pain and fire roared through her, but she didn't stop. Not this time. And then, like the breaking of a storm, the pressure released.
A tiny, piercing cry filled the room, raw and beautiful.
Emma collapsed back onto the pillows, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. Sandy moved quickly, wrapping the squirming, crying infant in a clean towel and placing her into Emma's waiting arms. There she is, Sandy whispered, her voice choked with emotion. There's your Grace. Emma looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the towel, red and wrinkled, eyes squeezed shut, fists curled tight. But she was perfect.
Absolutely perfect.
Emma traced her daughter's tiny cheek with her fingertip, disbelief and wonder flooding her.
Grace, she murmured, the name slipping off her tongue like a prayer. My sweet Grace.
Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city, casting everything in soft silence. But inside room 5, the world was alive with the first cries of a newborn, the the soft whispers of a mother, and the gentle hum of hope rekindled. Sandy sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "She's beautiful," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mama." Emma looked up, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I couldn't have done this without you." Sandy smiled, patting Emma's hand. "You did all the hard work, sweetheart. I just showed up." Emma gazed back down at Grace, marveling at the rise and fall of her tiny chest, the delicate flutter of her eyelashes. For so long she had lived in fear of Margaret, fear of losing everything, fear of the unknown. But in this moment, with Grace in her arms, none of that mattered. "I won't let anything happen to you," Emma whispered to Grace, her voice firm and resolute.
"I promise, I will protect you, always."
Sandy watched quietly, her heart swelling with pride and admiration. She had seen many things in her life, but witnessing Emma's strength and courage was something she would never forget. The room fell into a comfortable silence, only the soft coos of Grace breaking the stillness. Emma leaned back against the pillows, her exhaustion fading under the warmth of holding her daughter. Snowflakes continued to fall outside, covering the world in white, as if blessing the arrival of a new life. Emma held Grace close, eyes heavy but filled with peace. She knew this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would not be easy. But she also knew she would face whatever came next with the same strength that had brought her this far. Because now, she had Grace. 3 years passed since that snowy night in room 5 when Grace first entered the world. Emma had rebuilt her life in a small, modest apartment on the outskirts of Austin. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked with every step, but it was home, safe, warm, and filled with the laughter of a little girl whose spirit seemed unbreakable. Emma worked tirelessly at the local diner, taking double shifts whenever she could, while Sandy watched Grace during the afternoons. The little girl thrived under Emma's care. Her curly blonde hair bounced as she ran through the narrow hallways, her bright blue eyes always full of wonder. To Emma, she was the light in the darkest of days, the reason she kept fighting. But life was not without its hardships.
One rainy evening, Grace came down with a fever.
At first, Emma brushed it off as a seasonal cold. But as the days passed, the fever only grew worse. Grace's tiny body shivered under layers of blankets, her cheeks flushed crimson, breath labored and shallow. Emma's heart clenched with fear. She rushed Grace to the nearest clinic, her hands shaking as she filled out the paperwork. The doctor, a stern-looking woman with graying hair, performed a brief examination before pulling Emma aside. "Your daughter has pneumonia," the doctor said gently. "She needs to be hospitalized and treated immediately. Without proper care, it could become life-threatening."
Emma's vision blurred.
"Hospitalized?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "But I don't have insurance. I don't have that kind of money." The doctor's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "I understand, but her condition is serious. The longer you wait, the greater the risk." Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the back of the chair for support. She thought of all the extra shifts, the tips she'd saved, the jar labeled for Grace hidden in her closet. It wasn't enough, not even close. Desperation clawed at her chest. "There has to be another way," she pleaded. The doctor hesitated. "There are programs, charity services, but the waiting list is long, and I don't think Grace has that kind of time," she said softly.
Emma felt the walls closing in, the room spinning.
She staggered back to where Grace lay curled up in a chair, her tiny body dwarfed by the thick blankets. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at her mother with a weak smile. "Mama, am I going to be okay?" Emma knelt beside her, brushing a stray curl from Grace's damp forehead. "Of course, baby," she whispered, forcing a smile through the tears welling in her eyes. "Mama's going to make sure of it." But Emma didn't know how. Not until she saw the wedding announcement in the local paper. Jacob Carter and Olivia Hayes to be wed at Carter Ranch, this Saturday. The headline blared across the front page, complete with a glossy photo of Jacob in his tailored suit, his arm wrapped around a beautiful blonde woman. Emma's heart stopped. It had been 3 years since she'd last seen him, 3 years since she had run from that suffocating mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child in her belly. She stared at the photograph, fingers tracing his familiar smile. A wave of emotions crashed over her, anger, longing, regret, but above all, desperation. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat beside Grace's bedside, listening to the shallow breaths of her daughter, feeling the heat radiating off her small body. When dawn broke, Emma made her decision. She pulled out the last of her savings, dressed Grace in her warmest clothes, and boarded the first bus to the outskirts of the city. The Carter estate was just as she remembered, grand, sprawling, impossibly luxurious. White chairs were arranged in perfect rows under tall oaks, flower arrangements draped across arches, ribbons fluttering in the soft spring breeze. Guests in designer suits and glittering gowns milled about, glasses of champagne in their hands, laughter echoing through the courtyard. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the gate. She felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, their whispers buzzing like insects. She clutched Grace tightly to her side, her steps hesitant but resolute. When she reached the entrance of the ceremony, the guards stopped her.
Excuse-me, ma'am.
This is a private event, one of them said, his voice firm. Emma looked up, meeting his eyes with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. Please, she whispered. I just need to speak to him. To Jacob. It's important. The guard shook his head, unmoved.
Sorry, ma'am.
You'll need to leave. Emma's breath hitched, her desperation clawing its way to the surface. She took a step back, looking over the sea of well-dressed guests, and then she did the only thing she could think of. She fell to her knees, clutching Grace to her chest. Jacob, she screamed, her voice cracking with raw emotion.
Jacob, please. She's your doctor.
She needs you. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned, whispers grew louder.
Emma's voice broke through the elegant ambiance, tearing apart the air of wealth and privilege.
She didn't care about the stares, the judgmental glances. Her daughter's life hung in the balance. From the front of the altar, Jacob turned slowly, his expression frozen in shock. His bride Olivia gasped audibly, her manicured hands flying to her mouth. But Emma didn't look at her. Her eyes were fixed on Jacob, pleading, begging. Please, she sobbed, her voice shaking.
Grace is sick. She's dying.
I don't have anywhere else to go. Jacob's face went pale, his eyes darting from Emma to the small child in her arms. Grace looked back at him with wide, fever-bright eyes, her curls damp with sweat. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her eyes, his eyes, stared back at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Margaret appeared beside him, her face contorted with rage. This is madness, she hissed, grabbing Jacob's arm. Get her out of here. She's just trying to ruin your life. But Jacob didn't move. His gaze remained locked on Grace, his breath coming in shallow bursts. For the first time in his life, he looked truly shaken. Emma, he whispered, stepping forward. Is she? Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, she replied, her voice cracking with desperation.
She's your doctor, Jacob.
And she needs you. The crowd remained silent, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Jacob's hands shook at his sides, his eyes glassy with shock. In that moment, everything else faded away, the estate, the wedding, the expectations. All that remained was the fragile breath of a child and the desperate plea of a mother. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The guests stood in stunned silence, whispers rippling through the crowd like waves crashing against a shore. Emma remained on her knees, clutching Grace tightly, her eyes locked onto Jacob's. Grace whimpered softly, her tiny hands gripping Emma's coat, eyes fluttering with the weight of fever. Jacob's gaze was fixed on the little girl, his daughter, his flesh and blood. Her eyes were unmistakable, they mirrored his own, the same shade of sapphire blue that ran through the Carter lineage for generations. He took a shaky step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. Emma, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Is she really? Emma nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks.
She's your, Jacob.
Her name is Grace. She's sick, she needs help, she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Jacob could move, Margaret's sharp heels clicked against the pavement, her expression stormy with rage. She grabbed his arm, her grip iron-tight. This is an act, she spat, her eyes narrowed with fury.
She's here to ruin you.
To ruin us. Jacob shook off her hand, his eyes blazing for the first time in his life. Enough, mother, he said firmly, his voice louder and steadier than Emma had ever heard it. The crowd gasped, whispers intensifying. Margaret's eyes widened with disbelief. Excuse me, she hissed, voice dripping with venom. Jacob stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Emma and the little girl in her arms. You lied to me, he continued, his voice gaining strength. You said she left because she was unstable. You said she wasn't fit to be a mother. His eyes flickered with realization. But the truth is, you forced her out. Didn't you?
Margaret's expression hardened.
I did what I had to do to protect this family, she snapped. That woman was not fit to bear the Cotter name. And that, she pointed a manicured finger at Grace, that child is a mistake. Emma flinched, pulling Grace closer, but Jacob's fists clenched. His jaw tightened, and for the first time in his life, he saw Margaret clearly, not as the towering figure of authority she had always been, but as a woman driven by control and cold ambition. You did this, he whispered, his voice shaking with rage.
You tore my famille apart. Margaret scoffed.
Family? A daughter isn't family.
Adopter is just another mood to feed, another burden.
We need a son. An heir.
Jacob's eyes darkened.
You don't get to decide that.
Not anymore.
He turned back to Emma, his expression softening as he knelt beside her, reaching out to touch Grace's hand. Grace flinched at first, then looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. Hi, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice cracking.
I'm your daddy.
Emma watched, disbelief and hope battling in her expression. Jacob's hands were gentle as he reached out to cradle Grace's head, his thumb brushing her fevered cheek. She's burning up, he murmured, his eyes flicking to Emma with urgency. We need to get her to a hospital. Now. Emma nodded, her breath coming in short bursts of relief and shock. I tried, but I didn't have enough money, she confessed, her voice trembling. They wouldn't take her.
Jacob's expression hardened.
He straightened up, turning to the stunned crowd, his voice rising with newfound authority.
Someone bring my car around.
Now, he commanded. A few men jolted into action, sprinting towards the parking lot without hesitation. Margaret stepped forward, her voice sharp and unforgiving. You can't do this, Jacob. You can't just abandon everything for a mistake, she spat out. Jacob turned to face his mother, his eyes blazing with defiance. That's my daughter, he growled, the words slicing through the air like a blade. And if you can't accept that, then I don't want anything to do with you. Margaret's face turned ashen, her eyes wide with shock. You don't mean that, she whispered, her voice faltering for the first time. I did everything for you, for this family.
Jacob shook his head slowly. No, mother. You did it for yourself.
You never cared about family.
You only cared about control.
He turned away, scooping Grace up into his arms with practiced ease. The little girl instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, her head resting against his shoulder. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Jacob glanced back at her, his eyes softening. Come on, he said gently. We're getting her help. Emma swallowed back a sob and hurried to his side, her hand brushing Grace's back protectively. They walked together towards the waiting car, the crowd parting in silence, their expressions a mixture of shock and awe. Jacob slid into the driver's seat, Emma in the back with Grace cradled in her arms. She looked up at Jacob through the rearview mirror, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible over the engine's roar. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. We're not losing her, he replied firmly. Not now, not ever. The car sped off down the long gravel path, leaving the grand estate and its perfectly manicured gardens behind. In the distance, Margaret stood frozen at the edge of the driveway, her hands clenched into fists, her expression a mask of disbelief and fury. Emma held Grace tightly, pressing her lips to her daughter's warm forehead.
Grace tired slightly, her eyes flickering open.
Mama, she murmured, her voice weak. I'm here, baby, Emma whispered, smoothing her hand over Grace's curls. I'm right here. And so is Daddy. Jacob's grip on the wheel tightened, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He didn't know what lay before them, but for the first time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He had missed 3 years of his daughter's life, but he would not miss another moment. Not if he could help it. The hospital lights came into view, bright and promising. Emma's hand found its way to Jacob's shoulder, squeezing gently. He glanced back at her, his eyes softening. We're going to make this right, he promised. Emma nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears of hope. "We are," she agreed. For the first time in years, she felt something bloom inside her, something she had long since buried. Hope. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room flickered above them as Jacob carried Grace inside, her small body cradled in his arms. Emma followed close behind, her heart thudding in her chest with every step. The smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of machines filled the air, a constant reminder of fragility and desperation. A nurse at the front desk looked up, her expression sharpening with concern. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for the clipboard. "She's burning up, high fever, shallow breathing," Jacob answered quickly, his voice firm and steady. "We think it's pneumonia." The nurse nodded, pressing a button on her headset. "We need a doctor in Bay 3 stat," she called out, motioning for Jacob to follow. He didn't hesitate, carrying Grace through the swinging doors, Emma clutching his arm tightly as they moved. They were led to a small room where a doctor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, entered moments later. He assessed Grace with quick precision, his hands gentle but methodical. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, checking Grace's pupils with a small flashlight. Emma stepped forward, her hands wringing nervously. "It started about 3 days ago. I tried everything I could," she whispered, her voice breaking. The doctor glanced at her, eyes softening. "You did the right thing by bringing her here," he assured her. He scribbled something onto a chart and handed it to the nurse. "We need an 4 for fluids and a full round of antibiotics. Let's get her stable." The nurse nodded, swiftly moving to prepare the equipment. Emma felt her knees go weak with relief, and she gripped the edge of the bed for support. Jacob stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "She's going to be okay," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for helping us," she whispered. Jacob's expression tightened, his hand squeezing her shoulder gently. "I should have been there from the beginning," he replied, his voice thick with regret. "I should have known. I should have found you." Emma blinked back tears, shaking her head. "You didn't know. And you weren't allowed to," she replied, her voice soft but resolute.
But you're here now. That is what matters.
Before he could respond, the nurse returned, setting up the 4 with swift efficiency. Emma watched as the needle slipped into Grace's tiny arm, wincing at the sight. But Grace didn't stir, she was too weak, her breaths coming in soft, shallow puffs. Emma smoothed her hand over Grace's curls, whispering soothing words as the nurse adjusted the saline drip. Hours passed in silence. Emma and Jacob sat side by side in the cramped hospital room, the beeping of monitors a steady rhythm in the background. They spoke little, but the weight of unspoken words lingered heavily between them. Jacob's eyes rarely left Grace, his fingers tapping nervously against his knees. Emma caught him glancing at her once or twice, his expression unreadable. Finally, just after midnight, the doctor returned, clipboard in hand. He pulled up a chair, sitting across from them with a tired but hopeful expression. "She's stable for now," he began. "The antibiotics are working, and her fever has started to go down. It looks like you got her here just in time." Emma's breath whooshed out of her in a shaky exhale. She felt her shoulders sag with relief, and she reached out to grasp Jacob's hand instinctively. He didn't pull away. For a moment, they simply sat there, hands entwined, united by the fragile life lying between them. "Thank you, doctor," Emma whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you so much." He nodded kindly, standing up and placing the clipboard at the edge of the bed. "We'll keep her for observation for a few days, just to be safe," he explained. "In the meantime, get some rest. Both of you." The door clicked shut softly behind him, leaving Emma and Jacob alone with Grace's soft breathing. Emma leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on her daughter's peaceful face. "She's going to be okay," she murmured, almost as if she needed to say it out loud to believe it. Jacob's gaze remained on Grace. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands clasped together tightly. "I missed so much," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her first words. Her first steps. I missed all of it." Emma turned to him, her expression gentle but guarded. "We did what we had to do," she replied. "You know that." Jacob swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. "I should have fought harder," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I should have protected you." Both of you. Emma's eyes softened, but she said nothing. There were too many scars, too many memories laced with fear and betrayal. She couldn't forget the silence, the way he'd stood by while Margaret stripped her of her dignity, her safety. Jacob reached out then, his hand covering hers. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. His eyes met hers, raw with sincerity. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he began, his voice steady. "I just want to make it right. Whatever it takes. I want to make it right for you and Grace." Emma searched his eyes, her heart clenching with the weight of his words. For so long, she had dreamed of hearing him say that, of him standing up, of him fighting for them. But the years of pain and struggle had left their mark. She couldn't just erase it. "I appreciate that," she replied softly, her hand slipping from his. "But right now, all that matters is that Grace is safe. We can figure out the rest, later." Jacob's eyes flickered with disappointment, but he nodded in understanding. "I just want to be there," he said firmly. "I don't want to miss another moment." Emma offered a small smile, her eyes drifting back to Grace. "We'll see," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. The silence returned, stretching between them like an unspoken truce.
Outside the window, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting soft shadow across the hospital walls.
Emma watched as the sunlight spilled over Grace's sleeping face, filling the room with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Emma allowed herself a sliver of hope. The days following Grace's recovery were filled with cautious hope. Emma stayed by her daughter's side at the hospital, watching each steady breath with a mix of relief and disbelief. Grace's fever gradually broke, and her cheeks regained their healthy blush. Nurses would stop by to coo at the bright-eyed little girl who always seemed to smile, despite her fragile state. Jacob rarely left the hospital. He slept in the waiting room, stretched across uncomfortable chairs, his jacket serving as a makeshift pillow. He brought Emma coffee every morning, the cups steaming and rich with the smell of roasted beans. He never asked if she wanted it, he simply placed it in her hands and sat quietly beside her. Their conversations were sparse but genuine, stripped of pretenses and guarded walls. They spoke of Grace, of her favorite bedtime stories, her love for wildflowers, and her endless curiosity. Jacob hung on every word, his eyes lighting up whenever Emma shared a new detail about their daughter's life. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the hospital windows, Margaret appeared. Her presence swept into the room like a cold draft, heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Emma stiffened, her hands instinctively moving to shield Grace, though the little girl remained fast asleep. Jacob stood, his expression tense. "Mother," he greeted, his voice clipped. Margaret's gaze flickered from her son to Emma, and finally landed on the sleeping child. Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. "So," she began, her voice laced with disdain.
"This is what you've thrown everything away for."
Emma bristled, her fingers curling around the edge of Grace's blanket. But before she could speak, Jacob stepped forward. "That's my daughter," he said firmly, his voice steady and resolute. "And you will not speak about her that way." Margaret's eyes widened, disbelief flooding her features. "Your daughter," she spat. "That little girl is nothing but a mistake. You think you can just bring her back into your life and pretend everything is fine? That she belongs here?" Jacob's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "Yes," he replied, his voice unwavering. "That's exactly what I think."
Margaret's expression twisted with rage.
"You're ruining everything," she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous.
"The estate, the family name, our legacy.
You're throwing it all away for her." Jacob met her gaze steadily, his shoulders squared. "I would rather throw it all away than lose my daughter again," he declared. The words hung heavy in the air, their finality cutting through the tension like a knife. Margaret stepped back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't mean that," she whispered, voice shaking.
"You're juste, confused. On se dispasse, you'll release what you've done."
Jacob shook his head, his eyes softening but his stance firm. "I'm not confused, Mother," he replied gently. "I'm finally seeing things clearly." A silence stretched between them, weighted and suffocating. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached out, but Jacob did not move. Finally, she dropped her hands to her sides, her expression hardening. "If you do this," she warned, her voice like ice, You are no longer my son. Jacob's eyes flickered with pain, but he did not waver. I guess that's the price I'll have to pay, he replied softly. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his for any sign of hesitation. When she found none, she turned sharply on her heel, heels clacking in sharp staccato as she exited the room. The door swung shut behind her with a decisive thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands still trembling. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jacob turned back to her, his expression resolute. Yes, I did, he replied. I should have done it a long time ago. Emma searched his eyes, disbelief and cautious hope flickering across her features. But, you gave up everything, she said, her voice cracking. The estate, your inheritance, all of it. Jacob stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. None of it matters, he replied firmly.
Not without you. Not without Grace.
Emma blinked back tears, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't dared to feel for so long. The walls she had built around herself, the ones forged from pain and betrayal, began to crack, just a little. For the next few days, Jacob stayed at the hospital, sleeping on the chair beside Grace's bed, holding her tiny hand whenever she stirred. He read her stories from the worn books Emma had carried with her from the motel, his voice soft and soothing. Grace would listen intently, her eyes wide with fascination, as if she were soaking in every word. Emma watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her heart warring between hope and fear. She had never seen Jacob like this, so attentive, so present. The man who had once stood silently beside his mother as Emma was cast out now sat cradling his daughter's hand, whispering promises of better days. On the day Grace was finally discharged, the nurses gathered to say their goodbyes. The little girl grinned from ear to ear, waving enthusiastically as Jacob scooped her up in his arms. Emma followed close behind, clutching a bag of prescriptions and papers. They stepped outside into the sunlight, its warmth spreading over them like a blessing. Jacob turned to Emma, Grace balanced on his hip. Come home with me, he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. Emma hesitated, her fingers twisting in her coat pocket. Home, she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. Jacob nodded. I bought a place. Small, nothing like the estate, but it's ours. No one can take it from us. Emma's breath caught in her throat. You did that? He smiled softly. I did. For you. For Grace. For us. Tears spilled over her cheeks before she could stop them. For the first time in a long while, the walls around her heart crumbled just a bit more. She reached out, taking his free hand in hers. Okay, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We'll go home. Jacob's smile widened, his eyes shining with hope. Thank you, he murmured, his grip on her hand tightening. And with that, they walked away from the hospital, hand in hand, Grace giggling in Jacob's arms as they stepped into a new beginning. For the first time in years, Emma dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could finally be a family. The small cottage stood at the edge of town, nestled between two towering oak trees whose branches stretched protectively over the roof. Sunlight filtered through their leaves, casting dappled shadows across the porch where a pair of rocking chairs swayed gently in the breeze. Emma stood at the threshold, her hands clutching the strap of her worn leather bag, eyes wide with disbelief. This is it, Jacob said softly, standing beside her with Grace perched on his hip, her tiny arms wrapped securely around his neck. Our home.
Emma stepped forward, the wooden plank creaking beneath her feet.
She reached out, touching the weathered doorframe, her fingers grazing the grain of the wood. It felt solid, real.
Tears pricked her eyes.
It's beautiful, she whispered. Jacob smiled, his eyes warm and soft. It needs a little work, he admitted, glancing at the peeling paint and cracked shutters. But I thought, maybe we could fix it up. Together. Emma looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotions she had long since buried. I'd like that, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stepped inside, the floorboards groaning gently beneath their weight. The living room was modest but cozy, with a stone fireplace and a threadbare rug stretched across the floor.
Sunlight streamed in through the dusty windows, casting long streaks of light that danced along the walls.
Emma walked through the space, her fingers brushing the mantel, the edges of the worn sofa, the small bookshelf tucked away in the corner. There were signs of life, fresh flowers in a vase, a soft blanket draped over the arm of the couch, a picture frame with a photo of Grace, giggling on Jacob's shoulders, her curls bouncing in the wind.
You did all this?
Emma asked, turning back to him, her voice thick with disbelief. Jacob nodded, his gaze dropping to Grace, who was now squirming in his arms, eager to explore. He set her down gently, and she toddled off with unsteady steps, her laughter ringing out as she chased after the dust motes floating in the sunlight. Emma watched her for a long moment before looking back at Jacob. I never thought I'd have this, she murmured, her voice cracking. A home.
A real home.
Jacob stepped closer, his hand reaching out to take hers. You do now, he said firmly. And I swear to you, I'm not going anywhere.
No te ver again.
Emma searched his eyes, her defenses crumbling bit by bit. She could see the sincerity there, the raw determination etched into his features. For so long she had feared him, feared his absence, feared his silence, but now he stood before her, unwavering and resolute. Her hand tightened around his, and she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered, the word carrying with it years of pain, of hope, of forgiveness. Jacob's face softened, and for the first time, Emma saw the boy she once loved, hidden beneath the lines of regret and longing. His hand brushed her cheek gently, and she leaned into the touch, letting the warmth of it seep into her bones. Outside, Grace's giggles grew louder as she stumbled upon a patch of wildflowers growing by the fence. She plucked a few with her tiny hands, holding them up triumphantly.
Mama.
Look, she cried, waving them above her head. Emma laughed, her heart swelling with pure, unbridled joy. I see, sweetheart, she called back, her voice catching in her throat. Jacob squeezed her hand once more, then released it, stepping forward to scoop Grace up into his arms. You found flowers, huh? He murmured, brushing a stray curl from her face. Grace nodded enthusiastically, holding the flowers up to his nose. Emma watched them, her heart brimming with emotions she had buried for so long. Hope, love, family. Words she had once thought were lost to her forever now bloomed brightly before her, tangible and real. For the next few months, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Emma took a job at a local bakery, working the early morning shifts while Jacob managed carpentry work around town. They spent their evenings together, fixing up the house, painting walls, and mending fences. Grace thrived under their care, her laughter filling every corner of their little home. Sandy visited often, bringing fresh pies and gossip from the diner, her laughter ringing out through the small kitchen as she and Emma shared stories over cups of coffee. For the first time in years, Emma felt grounded, safe. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned shades of amber and crimson, Emma stepped onto the porch to retrieve the mail. Bills, a grocery flyer, and a plain white envelope with no return address. Her brow furrowed as she flipped it over, feeling the weight of something heavy inside. Curious, she slipped her finger under the seal and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Her heart stopped as she scanned the first page, Carter Estate Settlement and Disbursement of Funds. Beneath it was a handwritten note in elegant script. For Grace. I may not have agreed with your choices, but I cannot turn my back on my own blood. May she grow strong and happy.
Margaret Carter.
Emma's hands shook as she flipped through the papers, trust funds, property rights, educational savings. It was all there, meticulously detailed and signed. Margaret had set up an entire future for Grace, secured and untouched by family politics or expectations. Emma stood on the porch, the envelope dangling from her fingertips as she processed the gravity of it all. For years, she had battled against the memory of Margaret, against the harsh words, the disdain, the bitterness. But now in her hands, was proof that even the coldest hearts could change. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. You all right? He asked, his eyes flicking to the papers in her hand. Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. It's from your mother, she whispered, her voice trembling. She did this for Grace. Jacob's eyes widened with surprise, his gaze softening as he stepped closer. He took the papers from her hands, flipping through them in disbelief. I can't believe it, he murmured. Emma smiled softly, her hand slipping into his. Maybe people really can change, she whispered. Jacob looked down at her, his eyes shining with gratitude and hope. I think, maybe we all have, he replied gently. Emma squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with the weight of 1,000 second chances. They stood there for a moment longer, the crisp breeze fluttering around them, carrying with it the scent of fresh beginnings. Behind them, Grace's laughter floated through the open window, bright and unburdened. And for the first time in a long while, Emma allowed herself to believe that happiness, simple, untainted happiness, was finally within their grasp.